Good morning, or depending on when you're watching this, good afternoon, good evening, or good night. My name is Ross, and as always, talking out of Voice Radio. So today, we are taking a look at a very exciting new Keldeo card. Now, Keldeo has 110 HP, which for big basics is not particularly good. Recently, I seem to be drawn to the example of Reshiram, but he came out in black and white, which was a long time ago at this stage, and at 130 HP, 110, not particularly strong. Now, being a water Pokemon means you are hitting weakness against things like Volcanion, which is good, because that's a very good deck, and the weakness to grass. I'm not sure how bad this really is, because you're weak to Vespiquen, but that's getting rotated. You're weak to Tapu Bulu, but he's going to be getting a one-hit KO anyway. I suppose it does mean that Lurantis will KO you very easily. The retreat of 2 is a little bit rubbish, but then again, the main attack you're going to be using is for 2 energy, so it's not really the end of the world if you have to discard them in the event that you have to retreat. And being a water Pokemon means you've got Aqua Patch, so if you've got any water energy in a discard, you can reattach it to a benched water Pokemon. And you've got the phenomenal Stadium Brooklet Hill, which just allows you to search for a basic water Pokemon and pop it on your bench. Or a basic fighting, but who wants that nowadays? And the answer is anyone playing Marshadow, because remember that Marshadow can copy the attacks of any basic Pokemon in the discard pile. So if you pop a Keldeo in the discard, you can use Brooklet Hill to get Marshadow out, and then you can be rolling with a fighting type attacker. Although of course he's not a water Pokemon, so Aqua Patch is off limits. Now the first attack for Keldeo here for 1 colourless energy puts a water Pokemon from your discard pile into your hand. I just don't see many times we're going to use this. I mean, it's Rescue Stretcher, except it's an attack, and it's got to be a water Pokemon. Now, I suppose if you're item locked by something like Vileplume, maybe, although that, of course, is likely to be rotated as well, I just don't really see a huge use for this. As with all of these kind of attacks, there'll be 1 or 2 games you do use it, but it's going to be few and far between. The far better attack is the second attack. For 2 water energy, 20 damage, plus 20 more for each of your opponent's benched Pokemon. So if your opponent has a full bench of 5 Pokemon, you're hitting 120 damage. That, ladies and gentlemen, is pretty nice. Let's say you're against something like a Mega Rayquaza deck that is using Skyfield and has a full bench. Well, now they've got 8 bench Pokemon, which means you're hitting 160. Plus the 20 base is 180, and then you can pop a choice band on there to be doing 210, which actually won't be enough to KO Rayquaza, but you can always just play something like a Professor Kukui. And certainly if you're against a Raichu deck and Raichu's filling up the bench, then this is going to be a very nice counter to that. The problem is that your opponent is always just able to not bench Pokemon. And if they choose to not put Pokemon on the bench, then yes, they're slowing themselves down. They are, to use the old expression, cutting off their nose to spite their face. But it's still going to lower your damage output here. Now, you do have the opportunity to use Captivating Pokepuff, which of course allows you to look at your opponent's hand and force them to bench Pokemon, but there's no guarantee that they're going to have Pokemon in their hand to bench. Certainly I've played several decks with Captivating Pokepuff. It hasn't worked anywhere near as much as I would like it to. But then again, like I've said, against decks like Rayquaza and Raichu that have to have a full bench, you're going to be doing very well. Volcanion, you're hitting for weakness, and let's face it, Volcanion generally wants a bunch of EXs on the bench to use Steam up. Not to mention things like Incineroar, which needs to have a full bench in order to hit harder with its first and best attack. Now, this would be a really expensive attack if it wasn't for the fact that you would use Brooklet Hill to grab Keldeo out and Aqua Patch to attach that second energy. And that actually means that you can drop Keldeo as a proper surprise. Search it with Brooklet Hill, attach an energy, play an Aqua Patch, hit for 120. Which means you can, at least if your opponent doesn't know you're playing Keldeo, by game 2 or 3 of a best of 3, they're likely to. Maybe you had to bench it early, but a lot of the time they're not going to know. Which means you can drop it as a surprise here and maybe get that 120 when your opponent isn't thinking about it. And 120 is enough to KO a Garbodor, and 120 is enough to KO a Shaman. It's not a bad amount of damage. But the thing is, if you're hitting weakness against things like Volcanion or things like Incineroar, if that ever sees any play, I live in hope. Well, you've got to use water energy to attack with Keldeo. which means you've got to be playing a water deck, which means you should have good matchups against water-weak Pokemon anyway. Now, to be fair, something like Lapras against Volcanion could well be trading big one-hit KOs, which is nice. But at the end of the day, this is still a useful tech. This really is one of those cards where if you're playing an EX-heavy deck, maybe something like Lapras, and you're playing Aqua Patch and you're playing Brooklet Hill, this is a good non-EX attacker. Good for those turns where you just want an attacker who can do decent damage for low energy and when KO'd only gives up 1 prize. A Pokemon to force a 7-prize game. So your opponent KOs 2 Lapras. If they then KO a Keldeo, they haven't won the game, so you can then force them to KO another Lapras and hence take 7 prizes in order to win. This is not a card around which to base a deck. But as a non-EX attacker, in a water deck, you know what? I've seen worse, ladies and gentlemen, and that's why I'm going to give it between 2 and 3 Wassies. Maybe it should be a free Wassie card because it's a decent tech. You need to have one in your binder. I just don't see it seeing a huge amount of play. But remember, we don't give half Wassies. That would be barbaric. Although I do like the idea of having a sitting down Wassie as a half Wassie. That's kind of cool. Now you know the deal. Drop a comment down below if you feel so inclined. Go nuts. Be nice. Like this video. Subscribe to this channel. Follow me on Twitter @TheWassie. Follow me on Twitch at twitch.tv/PTCGRadio for live PTCG Radio action. And if you want to support the channel, you can do so at patreon.com/PTCGRadio. The most important thing as always is to look after yourselves until next time. Thank you very much for watching. My name's Ross and you've been watching PTCG Radio.